I've taught Microsoft Excel for about 10 years in a variety of textbooks and different versions of the tool. Until recently, we've always used the term PEMDAS, but in 2013 and 2016, we started seeing use of the word BEDMAS. So we're going to talk a little bit about an advanced order of operations. During this presentation, we'll cover, just a refresh on what is the basic order of mathematical operations. You learned this in school. It's PEMDAS or BEDMAS. We'll identify some of the non-math operators that Excel uses in formulas and functions. Some of these include comparisons, concatenation, etc. We'll also show a hierarchy of all 9 math and non-math operations. Review formulas are written. It's just a mathematical equations. Equal MC squared is one example. But in Excel, you usually start in a formula with an equal sign. Could be something very simple or something much more complex. When you're typing the formula in a cell, the formula itself will be in the formula bar. The answer of any of the formula or calculation will depend on the specific cell that it goes into. The different math operators that we've talked about in the past include addition with plus sign, subtraction, minus, multiplication is the asterisk or the shift 8 across the top of your keyboard, the division, and the exponent. Exponent is called a caret, C-A-R-O-T, and it's a shift 6. This is how you might denote something 2 to the 3rd power is a box that's 2 foot wide, 2 foot tall, and 2 foot deep. Excel has a standard order of operations that it uses in order to do calculations. Brackets, they override all other calculations that are being done. Exponents, the thing we probably use the least, but it comes up as the highest in the hierarchy. It'll be done first. Division and multiplication, addition and subtraction. It's really important to understand what these different, what this order is, and it's called BEDMAS for brackets, exponents, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction. But if you've gone to school more than a few years ago, you might remember as another mind trick is please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, or parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. Now, when this started up and we started seeing the term BEDMAS come up, I said, well, why are we using terms parentheses versus brackets versus braces? What's the difference? Why are we suddenly changing? So, to identify the terms first, the parentheses are the single left paren and right paren. You use them most of the time in your English. The brackets or square brackets have a square there to the right of the letter P or just above the enter key on the keyboard. The braces or curly braces are the shift on the square bracket key. The dictionary, if you look at it, just simply says they're all used to group items together. If you look in specifically about mathematics, it says that parentheses are used first, but if you have multiple parentheses, you can then go to square brackets. And if you have multiple square brackets, you can put those in braces. So there's kind of a hierarchy there. Excel uses them each item entirely differently. And again, here's a link to the mathematical discussion on how math uses those different components. Parentheses, we mentioned it before, equals MC squared. If we want to do the simple math, we've also used it in functions. Inside functions, the formulas, it shows the formula and function structure, it also tells the order that things are happening. The innermost set of parentheses are done first. Brackets, if you think about from the perspective of Excel, they're used to identify field names within tables. In this example, if we're going to add a couple of columns here, it's a table, we would be adding the event purchases table, the column number of members, as well as the event purchases table, the number of guests. And so that's how you would pull that information together. The braces, this is actually more obscure, and you're not going to find it in many of the basic textbooks, and it won't be on your MOS certification test unless you get up to the expert level. But in a single cell, I can write 1, 2, 3 with a comma beside each of them, and followed by a semicolon, 4, 5, 6, semicolon, 7, 8, 9, and then we close the curly bracket. What that does is that inside a single cell, if you type this, the commas identify things that are going to be in different columns in the same row, whereas the semicolons identify things that will go in different rows. So in this example we're talking about here, the data is entered there, but then it flows down into what's called a spilled array. So the data is only in the first cell, but it is displayed in the ones underneath it. Notice that there's got a blue border around it, and if you were to highlight any but the first cell, they're actually grayed out. So after the analysis, it's kind of like if we're talking about hierarchy or order of operations, we're really just using the parentheses. We're not using the brackets. We're not using the curly braces. They're for something else. Other operators, though, when I started looking into this, I found that there are other operators we needed to bring into account. One of them is the reference operators. That is the comma or the symbol that we use to separate items. You also have the colon, that's identified as a range, and you also have a space. The second item is called negation. And if I put a minus beside a 1, it means something different than simply a 1 by itself. I can also use it to make an entire calculation negative instead of positive. You've also got percentage. 95% is equal to when you're multiplying by 0.95. And concatenation. By accident one time, I discovered I meant to put a plus symbol in between here, and I accidentally entered the and symbol. Simple oversight, until I realized that it had taken the contents of the cells, instead of adding them together, it was actually concatenating them. And then the final thing that we'll deal with is comparison. And in this case, it's equal to, less than or greater than, or combinations. Greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, or less than or greater than. The referential operators we talked about earlier, the colon is a range operator. It helps us identify all the things in a given range that could be included. You can also use it in some cases to create a spilled array, similar to what we saw earlier. A comma is simply separates function operators or formula operators. In the first case, we can say equal sum E2, comma E3, comma E4, comma E5. That does the same as the formula at the top where we're summing that entire range. Just takes longer to type it in. In the next example, the round, we can use the round command, but we're we separate the different arguments in that function by commas. The reference operators, the last one is the space. In most cases, if you put a space in a formula or you see it inside a formula, it's probably a mistake. However, there is a case where you want to do that, and that's where you want to find out the area that intersects two separate ranges. So in this case, we look here, the area that's common to both these ranges, the red and the blue one, I've highlighted it in gold here. And if you type that in with the space, it'll actually create another spilled array that we talked about here. It will actually, instead of making it separate though, it'll go ahead and put it right where you typed in the formula. So spilled arrays are coming up into some of these things, and I can see uses for them, but in a lot of the day-to-day Excel, you may not be using these. But you have to keep them in mind in case you run across them. One of the things about this is it's also dynamic, because if they change the cells above by saying instead of having 2 members, you have 3, or instead of having 4, you have 6, well, then that will change the overall calculation and how it flows downward. The negation we talked about earlier, negative numbers are less than 0. Positive numbers are greater than 0. Negation converts a number to its opposite. So it would convert a 5 to a negative 5, or oppositely, if it was a negative number, it would convert it to a positive one. Multiplications of using negatives or negation can really be confusing. So we set it up at a separate item here. Number one, if I put the negation right beside a number like the -20, the answer is a -20. In this case, I put the negation right beside the cell reference, so it flips it negative. Where the cell is 10, the answer to this item is a -10. We can also use it as, in this case, to switch a negative number to a positive, as we talked about earlier. Or in this case, if we multiply a positive times a negative, it'll give us a negative. And again, if we negative times a negative, will actually give us a positive. So the -5 times the -5 will give us a positive 25. If I move the minus sign outside the parentheses, that negation takes place after it's done the multiplication. And then if I take that to the third power, again, the first multiplication gives us the negative times a negative gives us a positive, and then that positive times a negative gives us a negative. So it can definitely be confusing. Just keep that in mind when you're dealing with negation. Percentages deal with the same number that's over 100. In this case, 95%, if you're doing the math, is equal to 0.95. It's also equal, if you break that down to common denominators, 19 over 20. So if 100% is all the items being discussed, then 95 is a good piece of that. Like our group sold 95% of last year's sales. The other group only sold 5%. If you're wanting to show growth, you can use numbers that are greater than 100%, like comparing 2 years to one another. Infection rates are 125% over last month's total, as an example. That shows a 25% increase, but it's the over last month. If it was 2,000 last month and it's 2,500 this month, that's another example. But again, if you break that down, it's 125 over 100. And if we're only talking about a very small number, let's say last month it was 4 and this month it's 5, it's still a 25% increase. but in reality, it's only one instance. So that those numbers can be a little misleading when you see the people use them in charts. You have to look at where the numbers come from. I mentioned earlier that using the and sign is like using the concatenation function in order to pull different components together. Well, in this case, we could pull the first name, John, put an and sign between it, a space, and an and symbol, and the Smith gives us the John space Smith that we see here. Most recently, they came up with a new version of a new function called join text that has more powerful, but it's also more complex. But we won't go into that today. Comparisons are used to compare two different values to one another. The comparison indicators include less than, greater than, equal, or combinations of the two. If I just simply do the symbol here, if you look at the equation above, E3 is equal to or greater than 150, that's really only going to give us a true or false. It's either greater than 100 or equal to 150, or it's not. It's less than. Normally, we'll use something like this if included as part of an if state, whereas the first item just gives us true or false. When you combine it with an if, it allows us to put in the fact that this person gets a bonus if they get above 150, or if they don't reach that, they don't get the bonus. That's where the double quotes come in. We can also use it in formulas like not just the if, but the sum if, the average ifs, and the other groups of functions like that. So we've covered a bunch of different items here. And again, most of the reason we're doing this now is that I've got classes that have taken basic, intermediate, and advanced. We can now include all the items, not just the basic BEDMAS, but the other parts of where we've covered in these different textbooks. But if we bring everything into account, number one, instead of just BEDMAS, we start out with brackets, but then we've got the referential operators, the commas, the spaces, etc. Within that, calculate a negation. Next comes the percentage. Then we get into the exponents, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction that we saw at the very beginning. And then finally, we go into concatenate. And once we've done these different items, then we can check on the comparison to give us that true-false switch, or if you're combining with an if statement, it'll cause that to do one action or another. So I hope that you've gotten quite a bit out of this. This is, again, you're covering topics in basic through advanced Excel in this case, but it kind of pulls some of those items that you thought about in textbooks all together in one item. Thank you.